He saw, then surprised me. Chapter 1, Silent Toast. The bar was crowded, but Victory felt alone. Sitting at the counter, she twirled her wine glass between her fingers, watching the red liquid reflect the dim light of the room. The argument with Peter still echoed in her mind. He had left early to fix a problem at work, but she knew it was just an excuse. He always had an excuse. She glanced at the clock. Midnight. The bar was filled with couples laughing, talking, exchanging glances she hadn't shared with Peter in months. A tightness in her chest made her take a deep breath. It was as if the world was moving forward while she stayed behind, trapped in a routine that no longer satisfied her. That's when she saw him. He was sitting in a dark corner, almost hidden, but something about him caught her attention. Maybe it was his relaxed posture, as if the bar were his territory, or the way he held his whiskey glass with a natural confidence. He had dark, messy hair, as if he had just gotten out of bed, and a gaze that seemed to pierce through anyone who looked at him. Victory couldn't look away. He stared back, and for a moment, the entire bar disappeared. It was just her and him, separated by a few meters but connected by something she couldn't explain. He raised his glass in her direction, a silent toast, and smiled. A smile that promised everything and nothing at the same time. She felt a chill in her stomach, but it wasn't fear. It was something more intense, more dangerous. Something she hadn't felt in a long time. He gestured subtly for her to come over, and before she could think, she was walking toward him. "May I?" He pointed to the chair beside her, and she nodded, sitting down. His scent was a mix of whiskey and something else, something she couldn't quite place but that drew her in like a magnet. "Look," he said, extending his hand. "Victory," she replied, shaking it. His hand was warm, firm, and the touch lingered a second longer than necessary. "Victory," he repeated, as if savoring the name. "A strong name. It suits you." She laughed, feeling disarmed. "And what do you know about me?" "That you're here alone, in a bar, at midnight. That says a lot." He was right, and she knew it. But it wasn't just that. There was something about him, something that made her want to open up, to tell him everything. About Peter, about the marriage, about the loneliness she tried to hide. They talked for hours, or maybe minutes, she couldn't tell. Time seemed to lose its meaning. He was funny, smart, and had a way of looking at her that made her feel seen, as if he could see past the facade she showed the world. When he finally stood to leave, she felt a pang of disappointment. "Until next time, Victory," he said, with a smile that made it clear there would be a next time. She watched him leave, feeling torn between guilt and excitement. Peter wasn't home when she arrived, and she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of what had happened. But one thing she knew, that night had changed everything. Chapter 2, The Perfect Marriage or Not. Victory looked at the ring on her finger, spinning it slowly as she remembered the day Peter had placed it there. It had been a perfect day, or at least that's how she liked to remember it. The sun was shining, the flowers were blooming, and everyone was smiling, as if the whole world was celebrating their love. But now, years later, the ring felt heavier. It was as if it symbolized not just commitment, but also expectations, responsibilities, and everything she had left behind. She remembered the early days of their relationship, when everything was new and exciting. Peter had been different back then. He would take her on surprise dinner dates, leave cute notes in her bag, and seem genuinely interested in every detail of her life. They laughed together, dreamed together, and she believed they had something special. But over time, things changed. Peter started working more, and the surprise dinners turned into quick meals in front of the TV. The cute notes disappeared, replaced by reminders about bills and appointments. And the genuine interest gave way to superficial conversations about work and traffic. Victory tried not to mind. She understood that Peter was under pressure, that he worked hard to secure a comfortable future for them. But deep down, she felt like something was missing. Something she couldn't name, but that left her restless. She remembered one night in particular, a few months before meeting Luke. Peter had come home late, as usual, and she was sitting on the couch, waiting for him. He walked in, tossed his keys on the table, and sank into the armchair without even looking at her. "How was your day?" she asked, trying to start a conversation. "Long," he replied with a sigh. "I need to rest." She stayed silent, watching him close his eyes and sink deeper into the chair. It was as if he were in another world, one where she had no place. She got up and went to the bedroom, feeling invisible. That night, she cried silently, trying to understand what had happened to their marriage. They still loved each other, she knew that. But the love they had now was different. It was safe, predictable, and somehow empty. That's when she began to question everything. Was this all marriage had to offer? Was she destined to spend the rest of her life feeling alone, even when she was with someone? She looked at the ring again, feeling the weight of expectations and the choices she had made. Maybe the perfect marriage didn't exist. Maybe it was just an illusion, something people created to feel better about their imperfect lives. But deep down, she knew she wanted more. She wanted to feel alive again, like in those early days with Peter. And without realizing it, she began to wonder if it was still possible. Chapter 3: The Encounter on the Pier. The wind blew strongly that night, carrying the salty smell of the sea and making the waves crash harder against the rocks of the pier. Victory walked slowly, her shoes tapping softly on the damp wooden planks. She glanced at her watch, almost midnight. The pier was deserted, as Luke had promised. Still, her heart raced, as if she were about to commit a crime. She wondered, once again, what she was doing there. It was wrong, she knew that. But at the same time, it was impossible to resist. Ever since that night at the bar, Luke had occupied her thoughts in a way she couldn't explain. It was as if he had lit a flame inside her, a flame that Peter had long since let die. She saw him before he saw her. He was leaning against the railing, looking out at the sea, his hands tucked into his coat pockets. The faint light of the moon illuminated his profile, highlighting the line of his jaw and his messy hair blowing in the wind. He seemed so at ease, so in control, that she almost turned back. Almost. "You came," he said, without turning around. His voice was soft but carried an intensity that made her shiver. "I came," she replied, trying to sound more confident than she felt. He finally turned, and his gaze pierced through her like an arrow. He smiled, the same smile that had disarmed her at the bar, and her heart beat faster. "I knew you'd come," he said, stepping closer. "You're not the type to run from what you want." She laughed nervously. "And what do I want, Luke?" He stopped just inches from her, and she felt the warmth of his body despite the cold wind. "You know what you want, Victory. You just need the courage to admit it." She looked at him, feeling exposed, as if he could see all her weaknesses, all her secrets. And suddenly, she couldn't think anymore. Not about Peter, not about the marriage, not about the consequences. All she could think about was how close he was and how much she wanted him to touch her. He seemed to read her thoughts. Slowly, he raised his hand and touched her face, his fingers sliding gently over her skin. She closed her eyes, feeling his touch like an electric current. "You're beautiful," he whispered, and before she could respond, he pulled her closer and kissed her. The kiss was like nothing she had ever experienced. It was intense, wild, filled with a passion that consumed her completely. She clung to him, feeling the world spin around her, as if nothing else mattered but that moment. That's when she saw it. In the reflection of the water, among the shadows of the pier, there was a figure standing, watching. It was Peter. He was there, looking at them, with an expression she couldn't decipher. Fear, anger, sadness. She didn't know. All she knew was that he was there, and he had seen everything. She pulled away from Luke, feeling naked, exposed. "Peter," she whispered, but when she looked again, he was gone. "What's wrong?" Luke asked, concerned. "Nothing," she replied, trying to convince herself she had imagined it. But deep down, she knew she hadn't. Peter had seen. And he had done nothing. Chapter 4, The Double Life. Victory woke up to the sound of the alarm, feeling as if she had spent the entire night in a dream. Or maybe a nightmare. She looked over and saw Peter sleeping soundly, his face peaceful, as if nothing had happened. But she knew it wasn't true. He had seen. He had seen everything. She got up quietly, trying not to wake him, and went to the bathroom. She looked in the mirror, hoping to see some change, some sign that the night had transformed her. But her reflection was the same as always. Only her eyes seemed different, darker, as if they carried a secret she could no longer hide. The day passed in a blur. She went to work, answered emails, attended meetings, but her mind was elsewhere. On Luke. On the kiss. On Peter's gaze. She tried to focus, but it was impossible. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Luke's face, felt his touch, tasted him. That night, when Peter came home, she watched him closely, trying to figure out if he knew. But he acted normally, as if nothing had happened. He kissed her forehead, asked how her day had been, and went to the couch to watch TV. She stood in the kitchen, staring at him, feeling torn between relief and disappointment. Why wasn't he saying anything? Why wasn't he confronting her? In the days that followed, she began living a double life. During the day, she was the perfect wife, smiling at Peter, making dinner, keeping up appearances. At night, she was someone else. She met Luke in discreet places, far from prying eyes. They saw each other in secluded cafes, empty parks, cheap hotels where no one knew them. Each encounter was an emotional roller coaster. She felt alive, desired, as if she had finally found what was missing. But at the same time, guilt consumed her. She looked at Peter and felt like a fraud, as if she were betraying not just him but also herself. And then there was Luke. He was everything Peter wasn't, unpredictable, intense, dangerous. He made her laugh, made her feel young again. But he also scared her. There was something about him, something she couldn't define, but that left her uneasy. He never talked about himself, never shared his past. And no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't figure out what he really wanted from her. Meanwhile, Peter started acting strangely. He came home earlier, brought flowers, made surprise dinners. It was as if he knew, as if he were trying to win her back. But at the same time, there was something in his gaze, something she couldn't decipher. It was as if he were waiting for her to say something, to confess. One night, as they had dinner, he looked at her and said, "You seem distant lately. Is everything okay?" She swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the question. "Everything's fine," she replied, trying to sound convincing. "I'm just tired, that's all." He watched her for a moment, as if trying to read her thoughts. "If you need to talk, I'm here," he said finally. She nodded, feeling even worse. He was good, kind, understanding. And she was betraying him. How had she gotten to this point? But deep down, she knew the answer. She had gotten to this point because she needed to feel alive again. And no matter how much the guilt consumed her, she couldn't stop. Not now. Not when Luke made her feel this way. Chapter 5, The Discovery. Peter came home early that night. He had left work ahead of schedule, telling his colleagues he had an important commitment. In truth, he just wanted to see Victory. Lately, he had felt that something was wrong, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. She seemed distant, distracted, as if she were in another world. And he needed to figure out what it was. When he walked into the house, the silence surprised him. It was too late for Victory not to be home. He called out for her, but there was no answer. The apartment was dark, except for a faint light coming from the bedroom. He walked toward the bedroom, a knot forming in his throat. Something wasn't right. He could feel it in the air, like an electricity that kept him on edge. When he reached the bedroom door, he stopped. The sound of muffled laughter reached his ears, and his heart raced. He opened the door slowly, quietly, and what he saw left him paralyzed. Victory and Luke were on the bed, completely absorbed in each other. Luke's hands moved over Victory's body with familiarity, while she arched her back, moaning softly. The room was warm, the air heavy with the scent of desire and betrayal. Peter felt a wave of conflicting emotions. Anger came first, a blind fury that made him want to storm into the room, pull Luke away from Victory, and reclaim her as his own. But before he could move, another emotion took over, excitement. He couldn't look away, hypnotized by the scene. Victory, with her eyes closed, didn't notice his presence. Luke, however, looked directly at him and smiled, as if challenging him. Peter felt a chill run down his spine. It was a smile of victory, of triumph. Luke knew he was there, and he didn't care. Worse, he seemed to be enjoying the situation. Peter closed the door silently and stepped back, feeling more powerless than ever. He didn't know what to do. Should he confront them? Should he yell, cry, demand an explanation? But deep down, he knew he wouldn't do anything. He couldn't. There was something about seeing Victory like that, completely lost in pleasure, that fascinated him. It was as if he were seeing a side of her he had never known. He sat on the couch, his hands trembling, trying to process what he had seen. The anger was still there, but now mixed with an excitement that shamed him. Why hadn't he shouted? Why hadn't he intervened? He didn't know. All he knew was that, in that moment, he felt more alive than he had in a long time. Meanwhile, in the bedroom, Victory finally realized something was wrong. She pulled away from Luke, looking toward the door. "Did you hear something?" she asked, her voice trembling. Luke smiled, unconcerned. "Don't worry," he said, pulling her back to him. "Everything's fine." But Victory couldn't shake the feeling. She felt a chill in her stomach, as if something terrible was about to happen. She got up, quickly dressed, and went to the door. When she opened it, the hallway was empty. But she knew Peter had seen. She could feel it. She went back to the bedroom, looking at Luke, who was still lying on the bed, completely relaxed. "He saw," she said, her voice barely audible. Luke got up, stepping closer to her. "So what?" he asked, with a tone of defiance. "He won't do anything. I guarantee it." Victory looked at him, torn between fear and attraction. Luke was dangerous, she knew that. But at the same time, he made her feel alive in a way Peter never could. Meanwhile, Peter was still on the couch, trying to make sense of what had happened. He knew his life would never be the same. He had seen everything. And he had done nothing. Chapter 6, The Power Play. Peter spent the following days in a state of confusion. He tried to act normally, as if nothing had happened, but it was impossible. Every time he looked at Victory, he saw the scene again, her and Luke, completely lost in each other. The image wouldn't leave his mind, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't decide how he felt about it. The anger was still there, of course. He felt a burning rage every time he thought of Luke, the way he had touched Victory, the challenging smile he had given. But at the same time, there was something else. Something he didn't want to admit but that lingered, insistent. It was an unexpected excitement, a morbid fascination with the idea of victory with another man. He tried to ignore it, tried to convince himself it was just a strange reaction to the shock. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized it wasn't that simple. There was something about seeing Victory like that, completely consumed by pleasure, that fascinated him. It was as if he were seeing a side of her he had never known. One night, as they watched TV together, he finally decided to test his limits. He looked at Victory, who was sitting on the other side of the couch, distant as always, and asked, "What if we tried something new?" Victory looked at him, surprised. "What do you mean?" He hesitated for a moment but then decided to go for it. "I was thinking, what if we opened up our relationship? Made room for other people?" Victory stayed silent, looking at him as if he had lost his mind. "Are you serious?" He nodded, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "Why not? It could be an experience for both of us. Something that brings us closer." Victory looked at him, trying to decipher his intentions. She knew he had seen. She knew he knew about Luke. But at the same time, she couldn't understand why he was suggesting this. Was it a test? A trap? Or was he really willing to try something new? "I don't know, Peter," she said finally. "This is a lot." He stepped closer, taking her hand. "I just want you to be happy, Victory. And if that means trying new things, then I'm willing to give it a shot." She looked at him, torn between guilt and hope. Maybe this was a chance to save their marriage. Maybe it was a chance for her to have the best of both worlds. But at the same time, she knew it was dangerous. Very dangerous. "I need to think about it," she said finally. He nodded, letting go of her hand. "Of course. Take your time. But know that I'm serious." In the days that followed, Peter started acting differently. He was more attentive, more affectionate, as if he were trying to win her back. But at the same time, there was something in his gaze, something she couldn't decipher. It was as if he were waiting for her to say something, to confess. One night, as they had dinner, he looked at her and said, "Have you thought about what I said?" She swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the question. "I have," she replied, trying to sound convincing. "But I'm not sure if I'm ready for it." He watched her for a moment, as if trying to read her thoughts. "That's okay," he said finally. "But know that I'm here. For whatever you need." She nodded, feeling even worse. He was good, kind, understanding. And she was betraying him. How had she gotten to this point? But deep down, she knew the answer. She had gotten to this point because she needed to feel alive again. And no matter how much the guilt consumed her, she couldn't stop. Not now. Not when Luke made her feel this way. Chapter 7, The Impossible Choice. Peter's proposal echoed in Victory's mind like a bell that wouldn't stop ringing. He had suggested they visit a swingers club, a place where couples could explore their desires consensually. The idea was tempting but also terrifying. She couldn't stop thinking about what it would mean for their relationship. Would it be a new beginning? Or the end of everything they had built? She looked at Peter, who was sitting at the kitchen table, drinking coffee as if nothing had happened. He seemed so calm, so sure of himself, that she almost convinced herself everything was fine. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. There was something in his gaze, something she couldn't decipher. It was as if he were waiting for her to say something, to confess. "Peter," she began hesitantly. "Do you really think this is a good idea?" He looked at her with a calm smile. "Why not? It could be an experience for both of us. Something that brings us closer. She swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his words. What if I'm not ready for this? He stood up, stepping closer to her. You don't have to decide now. Take your time. But know that I'm here. For whatever you need. She nodded, feeling even more confused. He was good, kind, understanding. And she was betraying him. How had she gotten to this point? But deep down, she knew the answer. She had gotten to this point because she needed to feel alive again. And no matter how much the guilt consumed her, she couldn't stop. Not now. Not when Luke made her feel this way. That night, she met Luke at a secluded cafe, far from prying eyes. He was sitting in a dark corner, a glass of whiskey in his hand, and smiled when he saw her. Finally, he said, teasingly, I was starting to think you'd forgotten about me. She sat down, torn between guilt and attraction. I could never forget you, she replied, trying to sound more confident than she felt. He watched her for a moment, as if trying to read her thoughts. What's wrong? He asked finally. She hesitated but then decided to tell him. Peter suggested we visit a swingers club. Luke raised an eyebrow, surprised. And what did you say? I don't know what to say, she admitted, feeling even more confused. I'm not sure if I'm ready for it. He smiled, a glint in his eyes that made her uneasy. Maybe it's a good idea, he said, with a tone of challenge. You never know what might happen. She looked at him, trying to decipher his intentions. Was he joking? Or did he really think this was a good idea? She didn't know. All she knew was that, deep down, she was curious. Curious to see what it would be like. Curious to see if it could save her marriage. But at the same time, she knew it was dangerous. Very dangerous. Chapter 8, Luke's Betrayal. Victory glanced at the clock, impatient. Luke had said he'd meet her at the cafe at 7, but it was already 7:15, and there was no sign of him. She tried not to worry, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He was never late. Never. She looked at her phone, hoping for a message, a call, anything. But there was nothing. Just silence, growing heavier by the minute. Finally, at 7:20, he showed up. He walked into the cafe with a carefree smile, as if nothing were wrong, and sat down at her table. Sorry I'm late, he said, in a tone that suggested he wasn't sorry at all. I got distracted. She looked at him, trying not to show how annoyed she was. You could have let me know. He smiled, a glint in his eyes that made her uneasy. I knew you'd wait for me. She swallowed hard, torn between anger and attraction. He was so confident, so in control, that she almost convinced herself nothing was wrong. But deep down, she knew there was. In the days that followed, she began to realize that Luke wasn't the man she had thought he was. He flirted openly with other women, even when she was around, and didn't seem to care about her feelings. It was as if he were testing her, challenging her to say something. One night, while they were at a bar, he started talking to a woman sitting next to them. He laughed, exchanged glances, and even lightly touched her arm, as if Victory weren't even there. She stood there, feeling invisible, as if she didn't matter. Luke, she said finally, her voice barely audible. What are you doing? He looked at him, unconcerned. What's wrong? I'm just talking. She looked at him, trying to decipher his intentions. Was he joking? Or did he really not care about her? She didn't know. All she knew was that, deep down, she felt betrayed. You can't do this, she said finally. Not when we're together. He smiled, a glint in his eyes that made her uneasy. Why not? You're not my girlfriend, Victory. You're married." She felt a chill in her stomach, as if he had thrown a bucket of cold water on her. He was right, of course. She was married. But at the same time, she felt he was being unfair. He knew what she was going through. He knew how much she needed him. "I don't deserve this," she said finally. He looked at her, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Maybe not. But you knew what you were getting into, didn't you?" She looked at him, feeling exposed, as if he could see all her weaknesses, all her secrets. And suddenly, she couldn't think anymore. Not about Peter, not about the marriage, not about the consequences. All she could think about was how close he was and how much she wanted him to touch her. But at the same time, she knew it was dangerous. Very dangerous. Chapter 9, The Final Confrontation. The night at the swingers club had been an overwhelming experience for Victory. She had never imagined she could feel so exposed, so vulnerable, and yet so alive. Peter had been by her side the whole time, but she couldn't stop thinking about Luke. Where was he? What was he doing? Did he think about her? When they got home, Peter surprised her. Instead of being distant or cold, as she had expected, he pulled her close as soon as the door closed. The kiss was intense, filled with a passion she hadn't felt in a long time. It was as if the experience at the club had reignited something between them, something she thought they had lost. He took her to the bedroom, and the night that followed was like a dream. He touched her with an intimacy that made her feel desired, loved, like in the early days of their relationship. The room was warm, the air heavy with the scent of desire and reconciliation. They laughed, talked, and for the first time in months, she felt truly connected to him. But deep down, she knew something was still wrong. The image of Luke wouldn't leave her mind. She tried to focus on Peter, on his touch, on the warmth of his body, but the guilt consumed her. How could she feel so alive with Peter and still think about Luke? The next day, Peter was strangely calm. He didn't talk about what had happened at the club, didn't ask questions, didn't demand explanations. He just went to work, as if nothing had happened. But Victory knew something was wrong. She could feel it in the air, like an electricity that kept her on edge. She followed him to the door, her heart racing. "Peter," she began hesitantly. "We need to talk." He turned to her, his gaze unreadable. "About what?" "About what happened last night," she replied, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "About how you're feeling." He looked at her for a moment, as if trying to read her thoughts. "I'm fine," he said finally. "And you?" She swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the question. "I don't know," she admitted. "I don't know how I feel." He stepped closer, taking her hand. "You don't have to know right now. But know that I'm here. For whatever you need." She looked at him, torn between guilt and hope. He was good, kind, understanding. And she was betraying him. How had she gotten to this point? "Peter," she began hesitantly. "I need to tell you something." He watched her for a moment, as if trying to read her thoughts. "What is it?" She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the words. "I've been seeing someone. Someone who isn't you." He stayed silent for a moment, as if processing the information. Then he nodded, his gaze unreadable. "I know." She looked at him, surprised. "You know." He nodded again, with a sad smile. "I saw. That night, on the pier. I saw you with him." She felt a chill in her stomach, as if he had thrown a bucket of cold water on her. "Why didn't you say anything?" He looked at her, his gaze unreadable. "Because I wanted to see how far you'd go." She swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the words. "And now?" He stepped closer, taking her hand. Now, I want you to choose. Me or him. She looked at him, torn between guilt and hope. He was good, kind, understanding. And she was betraying him. How had she gotten to this point? I choose you, she said finally. He smiled, his gaze unreadable. Then let's do this together. Chapter 10, A New Beginning. The decision to start over wasn't easy, but Peter and Victory knew it was the only way to save their relationship. They spent hours talking, setting clear rules and boundaries they could both respect. It was a new beginning, a new chance to reconnect and explore their desires together. Their first night at the swingers club as a couple was a transformative experience. They arrived hand in hand, feeling nervous but also excited. The atmosphere was charged with sensuality and mystery, and they let themselves be carried away by the energy of the place. Peter stayed by Victory's side the whole time, and she felt safe, desired, loved. They danced, talked with other couples, and for the first time in a long time, they felt truly connected. It was as if the experience had reignited something between them, something they thought they had lost. They laughed, touched, and by the end of the night, they returned home with a new perspective on their relationship. In the days that followed, they continued to explore this new dynamic. They went to the swingers club together, but now as a united couple who knew exactly what they wanted. They set clear rules. They would only be with other people if both were present and in agreement. It was a way to maintain trust and intimacy while still exploring their desires. Victory felt freer than ever. She no longer had to hide her desires, her fantasies. Peter was there, by her side, supporting her, loving her. And for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was living the life she had always wanted. One night, as they looked out at the sea, Peter took her hand and said, "We've been through a lot. But in the end, it made us stronger." She agreed, feeling finally free and happy. "I love you, Peter." "I love you too, Victory." They stayed silent for a moment, looking out at the sea, reflecting on everything that had happened. They knew the future wouldn't be easy, but they also knew they were ready to face it together.